All right, I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate making a subsystem in a command-based robot code. I'm going to go ahead and open up VS Code. I'm going to start by making a new project. So I click the WPLib icon, create a new project. It's going to be a template. I'm going to use the Java template, command robot. I'll put this in a folder on my desktop, and I'm going to call it demo code. Let's create a new folder there. Apparently I already had one there. I'm going to make that anyways. Select the folder. And I'm going to name this project demo code. And team number 7457. And generate the project. Project created successfully. Would you like to open the folder? Yes. And yes, I trust the authors from WPLib. When you start a new code, the very first thing it'll do is it will have to create all these files. So give it some time, let it do its thing. You'll see this % happens here. It'll tell you when it's done. While it's doing that, kind of to give you a heads up, what we're going to do, we're going to start by creating a subsystem. A subsystem is sort of a piece or section of the robot that has its own pieces of code, commands, actions that it can do. So in the past, we've had our chassis subsystem, we've had an intake subsystem, a shooter, a climber, things like that. They kind of live within their own space. So let me go ahead and open up this src source folder and go down to Java. And you can see here there's a folder called subsystems. Within that, the only subsystem existing right now is the example subsystem. So I'm going to create, I'm essentially going to create a subsystem for an intake similar to our 2024 robot. You can imagine this is an intake that turns on a motor to bring something in. It turns on that motor to, advance it somewhere further up the line. It would need to maybe run that motor in reverse to reject it. It might have some brake beam sensors to let us know when we have a game object. So I'm going to go ahead and start by copying this example subsystem file. I'm going to right-click it, select copy. Then within the subsystems folder, I'm going to paste. And you'll see there's a new folder called example subsystem, or a new file called example subsystem copy. I'm going to rename that. Instead of calling it example subsystem, I'm going to call it intake subsystem. Now, the first thing is it goes red. It doesn't like it. There's something wrong with this file immediately. And if you actually open up the file, you'll see that it doesn't like this part where it says example subsystem. You need to have this needs to be the same as the name of your file. So because I'm now calling this intake subsystem, I need to change that to say intake subsystem. And capitalization matters, so be careful. So this template here for a subsystem says, hey, here's the name of the subsystem, and it extends subsystem base. So that's sort of like your default subsystem code. You're gonna pull that in. I also need to change this here from example subsystem to intake subsystem. Okay, so at least now it should be happy with the naming conventions of this file. So the way this works is it says, okay, there's a thing called an intake subsystem, all right? And now what I have to do is I have to say what is in one of those subsystems. So this public class intake subsystem, in my example, it's going to have, first of all, an intake motor. In 2024, this was a CAN Spark Max motor, so a Neo. So the first thing I'm going to say is, hey, this subsystem base, it has a CAN Spark Max that we called intake motor. Oops, I misspelled public. Okay, so now it doesn't know what CAN Spark Max is. That's because that's a type of motor controller made specifically by Rev Robotics. And so I need to import all my Rev Robotics commands into here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go insert a vendor library. So I'm going to go here, manage vendor libraries. I'm going to do install a new library online. And this is where it wants me to get a URL from the vendor's website so that it can install the library. So let's go do that. Let's go to Rev Robotics, vendor library URL. Let's see if it's here. LabVIEW installation, we're not doing LabVIEW, C++ and Java. Here we go. Here's the URL right here. So I'm going to copy that. Go back here. I'm going to enter it as the URL for the vendor library. Hit enter. It'll recommend that I build to ensure these dependencies are installed. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Oh, it didn't like that. Okay, so it doesn't like that because there is a problem with, it still doesn't know CAN/SPARC Max here. And that's because I haven't installed the vendor library, I haven't included the vendor library here. So if I hover over here and I say quick fix, I need to import CAN/SPARC Max. You'll see that added this line of code right here. So now that vendor library is included in this file. So now I can do all the rev commands. Okay, so I've got an intake motor in this subsystem. What else do I have in this subsystem? Well, in 2024, we had a motor that would intake. We had a second motor that would feed to the shooter. So let's say that there's a second motor. Public. Actually, I don't know if this needs to be public. Let's just put that for now. Let's call this feeder motor. Okay, so we have two motors, one that intakes and one that feeds. In this subsystem, we also had a couple break beams. So these would be called a digital input. And let's call this feeder break beam 1 and digital input feeder break beam 2. Doesn't like this digital input thing. Let's see if I can quick fix this. Import digital input. This is from WhippyLib. Yeah, let's put that in there. So you'll see once again, it added some more imports. And now it's cool. All right, so we're saying that this subsystem has two motors and two brake beams. And you could add as many things as you wanted to the subsystem, things that are within the subsystem. Sensors, obviously motors, if you had servos, if you had a limelight, if you had any hardware that you've got on the robot that you need to define here. So we're saying this is what an intake subsystem has. All right, so the next thing is here within this intake subsystem, let's sort of say specifically what this one has. So we've got intake motor. So we said there's an intake motor up here, but let's define it a little bit better. Intake motor, it is a new CAN/SPARC Max. With CAN ID, let's say this is CAN ID 4. And the motor type is let's say this is K, it's a brushless motor, so K brushless. Doesn't like this. Let's see what the quick fix is on this. No. Maybe it's rev K brushless. Maybe it's like motor type. Here we go. Motor type dot K brushless. There we go. I knew that was somewhere. So we've said, hey, this intake motor that we said, it's a CAN/SPARC Max. And it's can ID is 4, and it's a brushless motor. Actually, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to change this can ID from being 4 to being called constants dot intake ID. So constants doesn't, it exists over there. Let's quick fix, let's include it. So let's import, let's see here. I don't know why it's not giving me the option to just include it. Let's try. There we go. There we go. So now my constants file, which is over here on the left, will be accessible. Let's go back over here. So it doesn't like that doesn't exist. The intake ID, I'm going to quick fix it. I'm going to create intake ID within constants. So now I can go to constants. I can say, hey, intake ID, let's say it was motor 4. Okay. That way later I can change that if I want. So I'm a big fan of putting those sort of constants things somewhere else. We need to do the same thing with the feeder motor. So let me go ahead and do that. Oops, I don't know what I did there. Undo. Feeder motor. There we go. We got that. And then we also need to define where the brake beams are. So feeder brake beam 1 equals new digital input. And then I'm going to say constants dot brake beam 1 ID. And feeder brake beam 2 equals new digital input constant dot brake beam 2 ID. All right, so it doesn't like that those don't exist in constants, so let's quick fix it, add them. And these are brake beams, so these would be plugged into our digital inputs on the Rio. So I'd probably make the first one equal to 0, and the second one equal to 1. I don't know why they're so disorganized here. All right. No, I also don't have the feeder. Let's see, intake subs. Oh, I didn't change that. So the feeder should have a different ID. And now we need to create that constant as well. There we go. Let me double check that that exists in constants. Oh, it doesn't have an ID though. Let's say it's ID 5. So that'll be the can ID for it. All right, so what have we done so far? We've created a new subsystem called intake subsystem. We went into those lines within the subsystem and called it the appropriate things, intake subsystem. We said what that subsystem includes, so 2 motors and 2 brake beams, and then we set up those motors and brake beams. I'm going to pause the video here, and then after this we'll pick up kind of making some functions and commands for this subsystem.